reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, beginning at verse 60. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe, and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life."
Well, Ellie, thanks for that reading. It's quite a tough one, really, isn't it? We sort of have this image of Jesus and his disciples, and they're following him around like a flock of sheep, but wasn't that simple, was it?
No, I mean, reading it for us today, it's challenging. It makes us think, how would we preach about this? What can we understand around those verses? And imagining at the time, the stakes were a lot higher for them in terms of if they understood it, if they were going to continue to be with him or not. It obviously raised some really big issues for them.
And when the going gets tough, it's all right when he's saying sort of nice things, but when there's some challenges in there. Yeah. It's interesting, we were chatting the other day about weddings and couples, how some couples now are perhaps less willing to sort of think about saying "till death us do part," or perhaps preferring to say, well, as long as we feel we want to be committed to this relationship. It's sort of that whole aspect of commitment is perhaps something that we struggle, but then they struggle with it here too, the disciples.
That there were different points in their journey of being with Jesus, and sometimes parts of that journey were really difficult, but you do have here Peter's affirmation that he recognises that this is the journey and this is the person that he wants to follow. And that's sort of what's missing a bit in the when we talk about the wedding and vows, that sense of saying, well, actually it's to this person that I'm committed, so whether the journey is hard or easy, I'm still committed to the person.
And I think you get that sense of a person. I mean, they've been living alongside each other, walking alongside each other for some time, and you get that sense from Peter, to whom else can we go? I mean, it's sort of like he's come to that point finally. It's interesting though, he says, "We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." So it must have been a journey for them too, watching Jesus doing these amazing things, saying some pretty amazing things, and then some really challenging things. So are they going to stick when the going gets tough?
I think the question that Jesus says, does this offend you? And I think is a question that surrounds us all the time. What offends us about Jesus' teaching, and that invitation to be part of that journey is also an invitation to let ourselves be rattled, to let ourselves be offended by, and wrestle with the things that we find difficult, rather than expecting it to be, like you say, sweetness and light and not challenging.
And I suppose like the church community, really. I mean, we know. I mean, I'm really glad there are some of the stories in there of the disciples having disagreements. Jesus has chosen them to be sort of part of his community, and yet he must have laughed, knowing that some of them were really going to, rub up against each other the wrong way, and maybe that's something about church life today too.
And that kind of challenge to keep going, even when it is difficult and even when we don't always understand, but to keep going in that faithfulness of being part of the journey.
Because so often you hear about people who are sort of, they get upset about something in the church and they say, "Oh, blow this, I'm going to go to the one down the road," and we're in an instant sort of society. If we don't like a brand, we'll change brands. So I wonder, there's a real challenge here, isn't it, to stick with that relationship and the hard places perhaps of relationships with each other. The hard graft.
Which is kind of nice to keep in mind the words of Peter of coming to, we've come to believe, and that constant process of our belief that it's not something that happens once and forever, but we keep exploring that with God and with each other.
Yeah, and in our relationships with each other. Yeah, well, maybe that's a good place to leave it. Thank you.